Okay, so I was driving in Beverly Hills before I moved to LA, and in Beverly Hills there's Rodeo Drive, which is always crowded and silly, and then a block over it's a quiet stop sign street. And so I come up to the stop sign, and because I'm a good driver, I come to a full stop,
Mm.
and uh, the door flies open, and I look, and it's Stan. He's like, "Lobby, they sent me here an hour earlier. The meeting's not for another hour. Do me a favor, just drive me around, will you?" And I'm like, "Sure, Stan. Let's just drive around." So we drove around for an hour and talked and joked and told stories, and then we pull up. He's like, "I think that's a right. Okay, let me off here. Thanks. Okay, take care." I stand. But like only in California would that happen, and only with Stan Lee. I mean, it was a convertible, so I'm standing there, and all of a sudden, like the door opens up. I'm like, the laziest carjacker ever. He comes in the passenger side, and it turned out to
Yeah,
be.
right. But real friendly about it, just real wonderful.
Yeah, hey,
This was
lobby. I'm like, I only know one person that calls me lobby.
way before Ubers or Lyfts or anything. You were the
Yeah,
the
long
first.
before. Yeah, it was a cigar store, and he had a meeting, and so.
Get to grab a cigar before the meeting.
And one time, he had me come in to meet Ringo Starr, who they're doing an animated movie for him, and so I had to like audition. But as I was getting there, I came to an intersection not far from that one, and there's a dog running around in the intersection. So I moved my car into the intersection. I stopped the car and I stopped traffic, and the dog ran into this front gated area and then into his house. I just said, "Hello." And this woman comes out. She was like, "Oh, sorry." I go, "You might want to, close the door."
Right.
So then I came in. They're like, "Oh, you're late." And I go, "Yeah, I had to rescue a dog." And they're like, "Oh."
So normal. I feel like as far as excuses for being late goes,
Oh, yeah.
like who can argue against that one?
One time, it's funny. One time I had a meeting with Jerry Seinfeld because I was going to see the set. And I was there, and I'm like, "Oh, I'm 10 minutes early. I can't walk in 10 minutes early. I'll look like a jerk." Like I'm I pull up and I'm like, "I'll just get gas for later." And I get in, and this, you know, probably the first time I'd ever seen a California blonde girl, and she gets out of her car and she's flipping her hair and she's putting in the gas. And I look up, and I had locked my keys in the rental car. So the guy comes over, he's like, "What do you do?" And I go, I don't know, how would I get in?" He goes, "The most you can do is like break it with a bar." And I go, "Break it 30 yards away from the entrance to the studio." And I'm
Yeah.
like, I can't spend 20 minutes here and then go in and be like, "I saw a girl and she made me."
Got this right. Hey, story as old as time. On that note, welcome to X-Men, a very, very special episode of
Oh
X-Men.
no, that sounds terrible. Rephrase that.
Yeah, that does sound terrible.
Very special episode. God is going to tell you about his uncle.
Hey, it is a special episode, man. I am so beyond honored to have, like, literally, you are one of my idols. So to be able to talk to you, to have you on, it's an utter thrill. So
Thank you. Will you do me a favor? Will you play some very special episode music underneath?
we'll look some up from like the
There's
yeah.
Zippity Doo Dah.
There you go.
Wait, let's just stay quiet for 10 seconds where you can put that music in. Ready?
Uh, feel like that was a good length of time. So to help me with this episode, I am joined by Justin. Justin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hey everybody, I'm Justin from the Ex-Wife Podcast, host that.
I've seen your podcast.
Oh, great.
Podcast.
Cool. Yeah, we talk about, my wife had never read comics before, and I've slowly sucked her into the madness that is being an X-Men fan and the continuity that y'all magical people create and weave and try and make sense of as we try and keep up with it all. And I just love that twist.
When did you guys start?
We started in 2020, a little COVID project, actually. She had wanted to start a podcast with a friend of hers, and it kept on falling through. And I said, well, I could just explain X-Men comics to you, and you could ask questions, and then it'd be a thing. And it became this real great activity that we just spend time. It's some of our longest conversations are just talking about comics or movies or going to conventions. So we're going to New York Comic Con in a week. And yeah, it's been a great time.
Yeah, that's good. I think it'll work out.
And if it never does, we have the name
Hopefully.
Swift Podcast, right? You know, it's like double entendre then, but hopefully not.
Well, I just set up I won't give you any of the details, but I set up a comic book TV series based on a comic book I created called Ball and Chain, about a couple about to get a divorce and then he gets superpowers. So, so I bring that up because, yeah, like you say, if it doesn't work out, you can still do podcasts from different coasts, or
Right.
Sure.
There you go.
you can introduce her new husband to the X-Men, just start over.
Right.
The name could be more literal.
Yeah.
Twice.
How about you, Scott? I mean, I feel like everybody should know who you are. If you're watching this, you know who Scott Lobdell is. He's a legend. He's writer of comics for both Marvel, DC. I was looking it up the other day. I believe I saw some Image stuff in there. Screenwriter. You just said you're pitching a show. I mean, what are you not like? What have you not written for?
Yeah, no. In fact, I did a horror comedy that came out a few years ago, and we taking it to Broadway. So as a musical. So it'll be my first musical.
That's awesome.
That's awesome.
Expanding the options. That's even better.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to write a novel yet. I've started a few, but it just never seems to take in my brain long enough. So I did an animated episode of Godzilla. That was fun.
From the animated series back in the day, or
yeah, that Matthew Broderick one where they're like, "You can't even see Godzilla. We will not show you Godzilla."
Yes.
It's a scary thing. We will not show you any Godzilla images. And then as soon as the movie came out and bombed, they're like, "Look, it's Godzilla." All these images of Godzilla. People are like, "Oh no, I heard it. I heard it stunk."
But I remember there was a tie-in. So it was common at that time. There was a tie-in animated series that I heard was much better. That was under you. So of course it was better. That makes
no. I only wrote. But I only wrote one episode. So.
Oh.
But what was interesting is they every time I come up with a creature, they go, "Oh yeah, we've already done that creature, so we can't do that." So I said, "What I'd really like to do," I go, "I know you guys would never let me do this, but I think it'd be cool if you have a character who's a reporter." And they're like, "Yeah," and I said, "Well, what if the whole episode is like an episode of 60 Minutes? Like it opens up with her filing the story, and." There's an interview. It's not like a regular story. It's, I guess what became The Office and stuff, like where you are telling the story, but then you're cutting with the interviews and stuff. And, instead of just showing the monsters, there's like security footage and there's, airplane flies by. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's kind of cool.
That's cool.
Said, okay, do that.
Yeah, I will have to look that up. I like that.
Yeah, it's called Scale.
Have you seen there's a new tie-in with the new films. There's a new live action TV series.
Oh no.
Pretty good. Monarch, I think it's called, based on the organization. Yeah.
Well, my episode was silly. It was Scale was a group of people who didn't like that the monsters were all taken to Monster Island, so they were trying to free the monster. It was I really wanted Linda Hamilton. I wanted getting Linda Blair, which is still fun, but
yeah,
I wanted that Linda Hamilton from Terminator 2, where she was like just so tough. You don't know.
That would have been awesome.
Well,
remember the speech when she's like, "You don't understand creation until you've carried a child in your." And he's like, "Mom,"
doing one-armed lifts. Love that. So, but. So I was doing some background research, and am I wrong in that you started originally with the intent of doing psychiatry or psychology? You went to school.
Psychology. I went to school for psychology, and I realized that everybody in the world had a problem, and if I were to be a psychologist, I would have to listen to everybody's problems. Boy, that's a terrible attitude for a psychologist. So I left, and
I'd imagine that mentality, that perspective influenced writing characters and what they're going through, right? Like to kind of get their mindset.
That's the thing is like, when you think, I mean, I start out with all those 8-page stories and psychology for, I mean, it's a lot of things, but part of it is conflict resolution. And what is a superhero story except for, introducing the conflict and, trying to resolve it in 22 pages or 8 pages or however many you get. And so, yeah, so that helped a lot. I thought, okay, I can still be in this realm. And what's funny is like, I have to take it all with I don't want to say grain of salt because that sounds rude, but I do have to keep it in perspective that when somebody comes up to me with a beat up comic book that I wrote, 30 years ago, and they're like, this is why I started reading in the first place. This is like my very first comic book. This was, a comic book that helped me learn English. I followed your X-Men for years, and that's how you learn. And so you have to take it with,
Humbling.
it's not something that goes to your head, but it does make you go. I think it goes more to your heart. It's like, oh, that's nice. Like it's interesting to, as you know, I think I was a stand-up comic for 5 years, and with comedy, in the moment you have accomplished your goal, which is to make them laugh. If you don't, it's followed by a deafening silence. But with writing, you write something and you don't know 20, 30, 35 years later, somebody comes up and they go, oh, you did that Captain Ultra story and it just, made me realize like anything is possible. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, that's nice.
It's awesome.
It's very interesting.
Resonating with people based on what they're going through or what they saw in the story. That's really great.
But also,
and again, you don't know until, years later. So.
Right. So you don't have that immediate feedback. You don't know on the spot if it works or not. So you can't adjust until after the fact, after the issue's already come out sometimes.
And what's interesting that I think that more than anything else, that kind of jazz mentality was, like you say, you tell a joke, you can't go back and retell it if they didn't laugh. You can't go, oh, let me try that again. And when I got the X-Men, I'd been writing, Excalibur, I wrote Alpha Flight, I wrote a bunch of 8-page stories. And when I got the X-Men, it was at a Christmas party, and I was working late in the office. Not that it wasn't my office, I just would be in town. I'd be like, oh, I'm just going to write when everybody else goes home. And this night at the Christmas party, Marvel Christmas party, and Bob comes into the office and he's like, walk with me. And this was the second time Bob had ever spoken to me in, the 3 years I was hanging out there. And, we go into the office and he takes out these 22 thermal fax pages. Remember when it was like thermal paper and they would all curl up?
Yeah.
And he puts them on the thing and he straightens them out and he goes, 22 pages in 24 hours. Can you do it? Yeah, it has to be done by tomorrow. And I'm like, sure. And in my head, I'm thinking, well, if it's terrible, everybody's going to go, well, he finished it and he only had 24 hours. So, you got to give him that. And if it was good, then people will be like, oh, shit, look what he did in 24 hours.
Right.
And so I think it was the stand-up because I had to do that for 6 months on both Uncanny and X-Men. And I think it was the stand-up background that was just like, okay, here we are. This is it. This is my break. I was never, I wasn't delusional thinking, I'm going to break in. I'm going to write the X-Men someday. Who would ever think they were going to write I mean, when I got there, Chris had been doing it for 17 years.
Right.
So literally would have had to be insane to be like, I'm going to. And in fact, one time, the only other time Bob and I spoke, we got into an argument and about he had approved a Beast story. And halfway through the Beast story, he decided he didn't want to do it. He wanted to do a different story. And it had already been started. And so I was going in the bathroom and he was washing his hands. And I said, I don't think that's fair that you, stop the story like right in the middle. He goes, well, I don't care if you think it's fair. Like, that's what I said. And I go, well, so we're, snipping back and forth. And afterwards, my friends were all like, my other comic book friends were like, I can't believe you got in a fight with Bob Harris. That's crazy. I go, why the fuck do I care what Bob Harris says about anything? I said, well, what's he going to do? Not let me write the X-Men someday?
Little did you know.
He and I wound up becoming like the best of friends as a result because we just had a lot. I mean, not that we didn't argue, and not that, he didn't want to go one way and I wanted to go the other sometimes, but I just, we both had an idea about like what makes a good story. so we so we didn't argue that much. We kind of like fed each other's creativity, and it was really fun. But every once in a while, I would read a article, and they'd be like, the reason why Scott Lobdell wrote the X-Men because he and Bob Harris were best friends in high school. I'm like, okay, I guess I didn't see him when I was in high school.
Secret best friends. Secret even
He
to the two of
graduated
you.
6 years before me or something like that. Or after me.
I think-
If you're listening, I meant after me.
I was actually thinking about this when I knew that I was going to have this shit interview. You guys are like the first, I'll put this in terms of X-Men speak. You guys are like the first class to come on the books after Claremont, like you said, kind of revived and brought back, made pop. I mean, by now, so many writers have touched the property and stuff, but
one might say too many.
I don't know how else to phrase this other than what was that like?
Well, I mean, it was interesting because I didn't have any time at all to fret about it. If I thought about it, I would have probably been shitting bricks for 6 months. But
sure.
As it was interesting because those guys had, before I got there, Jim and Wills and Rob and everybody already had their feet out the door with Image, but they had time to finish a few issues. But, like, let me see, I'll show you what happened. Do you remember that issue where Ghost Rider and
Wolverine.
Ghost Rider was in New Orleans and
yes, the Brood and Wolverine and
yeah. So what happened was, let me just show you this. Hold on.
About to get an exclusive. See it here first for the first time since 20 years now. Joking. But, so what brought you in?
You've seen comic book pages.
Yes.
So you know what they look like in penciled form, right?
Yeah.
So this is, I didn't get a plot. I got the layouts of a story that was being drawn. And Wills and Jim had a bunch of people that were working in their studio. So, they would break it down. They go, you do Wolverine's claws, you do Wolverine's hand, you do the background, da da da. And that's how it came to be. So I, every 2 weeks, would get something like this. Where is it? Let me see. Is my blurry on?
Yeah.
Okay. So check out this.
Is that Wolverine or?
Yeah. Well, the one with the 3 spikes, this was Wolverine.
Right.
And this was Ghost Rider with his flaming hair.
Makes sense.
In the middle was, so essentially it's like, Wolverine's like, I'm going to cut you. And Ghost Rider's like, why hell's balls you'll cut me? And then Rogue, here's Rogue, and we can tell it's Rogue because it's a circle with her hair.
Right. Yes.
Here. And her hand being like, stop. And then they'd be like, no. And they would lunge at each other and fight. Yeah. And that's what I got. That's what I was working with. So if you read those issues, imagine me sitting there with, circles and squares. And if it was Gambit, it would be a ace of spades. And if it was Nightcrawler, it would be pointy ears and a tail. And that was it. And so, I remember one time there was a scene where they were all in one area and the floor collapsed, which, if you were all standing in a room and the floor collapsed, you'd be in the room 1 floor lower. Right. But instead, they all got separated and they're in this labyrinth and they're going, I'm like, how are they separated? Did they all land in a different hallway or something? Wow, just stuff like that. So I had to, it was like I say, it was jazz. It was stand-up comedy. It was just like, I don't have time. All I have to do is I have to make it make sense and I have to have a emotional resonance. And then everything else, the story is the story. But so because of that, and because that was my life for 6 months, right in a row, what happened was that before Bob brought me to his office at the Christmas party, he had gone through his Rolodex and he says that he talked to everybody who was writing at the time. Okay. And he said, I need you to write an issue of the X-Men. They're like, and you only have 24 hours to write it. And so the theory was that everybody kept saying, look, I'm not going to ruin the X-Men after 17 years. So, you've got to figure something out. So he went to Fabian, and Fabian's like, I just saw Scott in Terry's office. And Bob's like, oh, Scott Lobdell, I don't know. Fabian was like, look, let Scott write, and then any other writer will come in because he'll, he probably won't do it well, and then they'll be the ones that came in and saved the X-Men. He at the time was scheduled to take Uncanny and X-Men, and Bob is very non-confrontational. Is the way to say it, and so he never told me, "Oh, you're writing the X-Men." When we got to the end of those 6 issues, which is when Fabian was supposed to take over, he's like, what would you do with Uncanny? Like, what would you do for the next issue? And I'm like, well, I would. And before you know it, I was writing Uncanny, and Fabian was writing X-Men. And God bless Fabian. I love him dearly, and we've become really, really good friends. But one of the funny things about the two of us is that, when Fabian starts on a book like X-Force, he will turn in the first 25 issues of a book. It'll be like, this happens, this happens, ta-da. And I would often come to the end of an issue with a cliffhanger and be like, and people would be like, well, what happens next? I go, oh no, I can't wait for next. I can't wait to start the next issue because then I'll know. And he's like, you can't do it. You can't just scroll straight. And I always say, look, if I can surprise me, I can surprise the audience. And that's what I, want to do. And I always called it like chewing my food twice. Like, I don't want to like say this one I'm going to do and this is the way. And then suddenly, have to next month go, oh, didn't I write this for you already? And I have to gear up for it. So I used to drive Fabian batty because I was just always like, I don't know what's going to happen next issue. And he'd be like,
and the two titles had to kind of run kind of parallel at the time.
He did. I mean, we sort of mostly did our own thing because the idea was to make it feel not like it was one book. Eventually, I took over, and then I wrote it almost as if it was a bi-weekly book, which I thought was really fun for people. But at the time, like he did things that interested him, and I did things that interested me. And I always tease him about Ravant, the salad dressing.
Yep.
But and meanwhile, I was in those probably that same time. I was like, look, there's too many X-Men. Forge would show up once in a while, and it was always like, Forge, he's Storm's greatest love, and Storm is his greatest love. And I go back, I'm looking at the issues, and I'm like, they haven't spoken in 20 issues. Like,
Sure.
I'm like, okay, well, let's get rid of them. Let's get rid of give Forge some time off. And it's the instant you ever write anybody out, they suddenly become everybody's favorite character. Everybody loves. How can you do X-Men without Forge? You'll be surprised. It's not that hard. So.
Right.
Well, then he went over to lead X Factor, so it all worked out.
And, especially with that way that he went out, I feel like that was really emotional and resonant with the way that like Storm. I remember that issue. Just their love, at least at the end, felt like it was resonant with themselves as characters, as this kind of duty that he felt to Mystique, and not thinking that Storm would take him up on that offer. And I thought that was really great to get into that emotional resonance in a superhero comic, having that balance.
Well, I will tell you, since you know it so well, I'll tell you what happened was it was supposed to be set up, and then the next, I'm sorry, what was it? It was, okay. He was going to propose in that issue, and then in the next issue, she would have to deal with it. And it was Will's second to last issue. And he turns in these pages, waits to drop dead last second, turns in the pages, and he wrote out the proposal. He's like, I don't think that made sense, so I didn't draw it. So I'm like, okay. So I'm looking at it. I put all his papers in front of me. I'm looking. I'm like, oh, he didn't draw any background. So what if I take this page and move it here and move this page there? And so then that scene when they have that moment of like, will you marry me? Actually was something that he drew for 3 pages ago. So I moved that page. So it ended on this dramatic, like, will you marry me? And then the issue comes out and he calls me up. He's like, okay, you win. You got me. So whatever you want me to draw, I'll just draw. Because he had his, he was doing wet works at the time. But so that happened, despite what was drawn. And I'm like, oh, okay, I can just change the pages. So it's funny that because it was a really big moment, for both of them. And the fact that it was a moment that I was able to pry out of the pages was pretty funny. So
That's cool.
See, I came in around 91, 92 with your guys' book. You know, I've since gone back and read a lot of Chris's stuff as well as continuing to read ahead, but I picked up afterwards, but I didn't appreciate at the time the sort of, I guess, turnover, I want to say, in those early issues, like Forge leaving. You also had Banshee leaving the mansion pretty early on, which, you know, I didn't, when I first read those, I didn't appreciate those characters' history or length in the books. To me, these were just my first time seeing them, and they were already out the door in the cab crying.
What's funny is that like I said, I was just in that place. I was just in Mexico City, and it's odd because, as you know, it's probably been about 23 years since I wrote the X-Men. But, you know, and I don't think about the X-Men unless I'm doing a podcast or something. But this was the first time when I was in New Mexico, and there's so many people there, and they all they did was bring X-Men. There was no Red Hood, there was no stuff. And I realized that, you know, like, I guess for all intents and purposes, I am married to the X-Men, you know, forever. You know, I'll die someday and it'll be like former X-Men writer still.
Right.
But it was also it felt really nice because, like, I don't know if you guys saw X-Men animated X-Men 97.
Yep.
Yeah, loved it.
I only saw the last episode, and I also saw the moment that Gambit died, which I thought was holy moly episode. So well done.
Right.
But I was watching the last episode, and there are like 4 separate plot threads that I created.
Yep.
And I'm watching, and I'm thinking, wow, this is like watching a really good cover band taking the material and just running with it, you know. And it felt really good. And I'm thinking to myself, like, wow, I felt like I was collaborating with these people that I had never met, you know.
Yeah.
And so it was like, you know, it just felt really, you know. So between that experience and then going down to Mexico City and seeing all those people and then doing the dance video, it was just like, oh, okay, you know what? I don't, you know, I will never, you know, there's no world in which I would ever write the X-Men again. But it's nice that, you know, people will always have those issues. And it's funny because later on when I wrote, when I was writing for DC and I started with the New 52, and, you know, some people read Teen Titans and were like, oh my God, this is a great version of Teen Titans. And then there are other people that were like, this is not the Teen Titans that I grew up with. Like,
sure.
Yeah, and it's like, but that's fine. Those books, they all exist. Right. Every story George and Marv worked on, they're still there. You know, you can trade paper, you do whatever. They're still there. And so I kind of feel like, you know, however many writers come on, those stories that I did for that time, you know, like somebody could do Operation Zero Tolerance, and they might do it better than me, but they also might do it worse and like just pump out crap. Right. But it doesn't matter because those issues are still
it
exists, right? The source is still there, and it's
animated.
It's this interesting thing that you're talking about, kind of having a reinvesting ideas into the content that already exists and saying, okay, what else can we do? How else can we present this in another medium? Or even the way that 97 took layers of stories and condensed them into itself to speed through for the different medium and really play with the big picture ideas.
But along with that, it shows that the stories that you present have a lasting impact, made an impression on people, you know, who then went on to create animated television shows or write future comics or do whatever.
It's kind of like the stand-up thing again. Like, you just don't know. You don't know what's going to, you know, resonate. You know, I learned that Bastion's name was Sebastian Gilberti, and that he was rescued by Rose Gilberti in the series, because she's mentioned by name. And it's like Rose Gilberti was my mother's best friend when I was growing up.
Oh.
And I was like, oh, Rose Gilberti, I love that name. And so when it came time, I used that name. And X-Cutioner was named after my psychology teacher in college. And he was thrilled that I, named X-Cutioner after him. And then I talked to him about 15 years later, and he went from being the head of the psychology department to becoming the dean of the college. He said that every year, somebody comes up and goes, "Hey, do you?" He goes, "Yeah."
Yeah,
And if you type in his name, they'd be like,
to Google.
X-Cutioner.
Right.
And then on the 7th page, it's like, "Oh, and he's also a college
Like
professor."
Dean, right?
Yeah, go figure.
The same thing happened with Happy Death Day. I was dating a girl named Therese. Her first name and her last name was in the movie, and I used to call her Tree for short. And so when I started writing, I'm like, "Oh, I like Tree as a nickname," so I called the character. And I never ever thought that, oh yeah, they would keep that name because it's Teresa Gelbman. It's not a name that necessarily
Sure.
flips fluidly from your mouth. But then we got, the opening credits, the opening minutes of the movie. She introduced her. So I'm like, oh well, okay, I guess she made it all the way in.
And I feel like that name works for that character. I already expressed that I have a real fondness for that movie. Horror and Groundhog Day are a film and a genre that I have particular fondness for, and I felt like Happy Death Day is just a brilliant mesh or amalgamation, if you will. Like it's similar to Groundhog Day in that, every spoiler, but every time something happens to the main character, it kind of like resets. But how did you get involved in writing that?
I just, I was talking to a producer, and I don't know if you know John Nee. You know John Nee?
No.
He was president of Marvel for a little bit, but we were close, and we would always bounce ideas off each other. And he was like, "What if, imagine if Julia Roberts was murdered, and then it was like Groundhog Day. She comes back to life, and she gets murdered again." I was like, "Oh yeah, that's interesting." And so I was talking to a producer, and I pitched this idea of a college student who, gets murdered and, essentially a slasher film, but it's Groundhog Day.
Yes.
I didn't know her from Adam, but we just had coffee, and about 2 weeks later, she called. She goes, "I can't get that idea out of my mind. You have to write it. You have to turn off your phone, turn off the internet, and just write it." And I wrote it in 4 weeks, and I turned my internet back on. And I said, "Hey, I got this script." And then it was interesting because it went to 15 producers, and each producer said no. And my agent would come back and say, they all say the same thing. They say, you don't explain it, you have to explain it. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. And I've been doing movies long enough to know that when you sell a movie, they do not think twice about, having you rewrite the whole thing. Or, if you had 5 cheerleaders, they want 3 cheerleaders because that makes more sense. It's like, okay.
Right.
And so I was like, no, that's not why they're saying no, because if that was why they wanted it, if that's what they wanted, they would have just bought it and said, explain, in 5 sentences why she's there. And I said, they didn't explain it in Groundhog's Day, and I'm not going to explain it here. And, guess what? There is no reason for somebody to move back and forth with that. So,
I love the fact that there's no explanation in both. There's no explanation for why Bill Murray's character kept on repeating the same day, Groundhog Day, or the main character in Happy Death Day.
And so finally, by the 15th person, they said, yes, we'll buy it. And, and then that's just how, just how these things happen. So, and, the other thing too is most of what I write, in fact, I would say all of what I write, is if I had gone to somebody and say, hey, I want to do Groundhog's Day as a horror movie, it would never have been made because the script would never have been finished because they would have, 10 people would be like, well, I think that she should do blah, blah, blah. And so I've discovered over the years that it's better if I just sit down and write what I'm working on, because then you give it to, in fact, I'll tell you another Stan story. Is Stan was like, geez, Bobby, I don't know, how do you do it with all these notes? He goes, I just sit down and I like to write, and, all these notes from the producers and the director, and I don't know how you do it. And I said, Stan, the first draft is art, and every draft after is commerce. So I do the script that I want to do from my heart, from, onto the page. And then if somebody buys it, then you know what, if they, want 3 cheerleaders or 35 cheerleaders, it's commerce, they pay
Sure.
you and you read it. That's that. All you can do is try to, make sure it still has as much of what was in it as original. So
The integrity or the original creative spark.
yeah, and you know what's funny to me, when people read, people read scripts like they read comic books, where you'll read a comic book and you go, oh, wow. And then you get to the end, you're like, oh my God, it's the Red Skull.
Right, sure.
But the thing is, you have that moment, and you have the moment with the character, and then you get done, and it's, a catharsis or whatever. But invariably, somebody read a script and they go, oh my God, I love this script. Those are my favorite script I read in 10 years. And then they'll buy it and then they'll go, it doesn't really make any sense. So the script that you just bought that I spent, 6 months working on doesn't make any sense. Well, that's an odd thing to do, to buy a script that doesn't make any sense. But it's not really, I don't know, you guys tell me because you read more comics than I do, but you don't generally read a comic book, where Ileana dies at the end and you're like, oh, that's sad. And then go back and be like, you know what? It would be better if she doesn't die, and instead they throw her a surprise birthday party at the end. And you're like, well, okay, that's an idea. But as it is, the comic book is the comic book is the comic book. Whereas for some reason, movies are, everybody feels they have to participate in the
creative process.
And sometimes I'll just give you one example about Tree. Like, I would never make what we in comedy call a dick joke, because it's not my humor. But there's a scene in Happy Death Day where she's like, you don't bring a girl to Subway on your first date. She goes, it's not like you have a foot long.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it's a great line. The audience laugh. People love it. People reference it all the time. But I didn't write that line. I don't remember what line I wrote, but I do remember that I heard that she was on the set and she goes, can I say, he has a foot long? They're like, yeah, try it. And so it's a very collaborative experience. It's, so I'm not saying different ideas aren't good and they don't come from, actors or studio heads or whatever.
That's interesting because so I've done stand-up before, but I am more of an improviser, and I feel like that plays off that idea of you're putting something out there and someone else is bringing their creative energy to, and especially in a film where it's over such a long period of time and there are so many creative inputs working into the source, right? Versus a comic, you have a much faster, you had to write one in a 24-hour period, right? Like, you don't have a lot of time for cooks to get into the kitchen and dissect and say like, oh, let's try this. You're on much more of a tight timeline.
And I had a friend once who said, I talked to my friend who's a producer. I go, I kind of want to direct someday. He goes, Scott, you think about 30 ideas a day, and that is the opposite of what a director does. A director has to be completely focused on what they're doing for 6 months into pre-production, the 2 months of filming, sometimes a year worth of editing, and that's all you think of. And I'm like, yeah, that's probably not me.
Right.
Maybe TV, because TV is a much shorter window,
Turn around, and you get to do multiple episodes, even in the same show, but they get to vary. Like every episode of, TNG is all same cast and crew, but the stories get to be different. 1 week is comedy, next week is a romance. So
like me.
Perfect. Exactly. You brought up, we're jumping all over, but that's okay. This interview is like jazz.
I kind of think I'm the worst person to do a podcast with.
No, I
this
love
is
it.
Every podcast I do, it's like it just ba-boom, ba-boom, ba-boom.
You're keeping us on our toes. I enjoy it. But you brought up the death of Ileana, and it's a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier, where, look, when I read that issue for the first time, I didn't know who Ileana was, outside of being Colossus's baby sister. I wasn't aware of magic or the New Mutants or any of that at that time. I am now, but there was something in the way that story was so beautifully told that I remember the reactions from these other characters around her death and the way that it was handled. And this is something that I absolutely love about your writing. And the reason why I brought up the psychology thing earlier is, like, it moved me. I had no idea who this kid was, and yet her death, reading this issue, touched me. I don't know. Don't really have a question for that or of a comment. Guess.
Well, when Joe Casey, who is a good friend of mine, took over the X-Men, I said, you have to make people cry like twice a year. You have to just go in and churn their guts up and make people like put the comic book down and be all misty-eyed.
Mm.
And he's like, Mom, I don't really do emotion. So I'm like, okay, well, that's my advice. And I think it's what I did with Red Hood and I did with Titans. It's like, I just think you really have to, go in and, like that issue where, remember when Jubilee was, Professor X got shot after, I want to say, the Extinction Agenda?
Yeah.
And then he had
Yeah.
like a few hours left with the techno-organic virus where he could walk and Jubilee. I got something for you. Roller.
Yeah.
See, I love that issue too. And even that cover, that cover is burned in my head of them, the fall day in the woods in the back of the school. I mean, we talked about, I want to save this for when we do hopefully the live, but we discussed online your Thanksgiving issue, which is still one of my favorite issues. And I think what stood out for me and what made me such a huge X-Men fan that I'm still reading so many years after the fact is like so many of your stories are just character beats, that the old class going to the coffee bean or playing football outside of the school or Jubilee and Xavier going for a walk.
Well, and that's the thing is like, like you can, if it was just them having a game of touch football, it probably wouldn't be as interesting as touching on all these things. Like, okay, Bishop's there. He's never, he lived in a post-apocalyptic future. The idea of like playing games and, playing football, like what is this? It's like, so if you just are true to the characters and you put them in normal everyday situations, like, Professor X getting his nose broken from the football. It was just like, it's just so much fun to be like, okay, if you were here, what would it be like? What would, so.
Yeah. It really makes them feel real.
Yes, exactly. Like they're actual real characters with their own emotions. Yes, yeah.
And the head of marketing came down to the office and he said to Bob, it's been 4 months now and Lobdell hasn't thrown a single punch or used any powers at all. And Bob's like, oh, well, no, we'll get on that. We can, put in more action. He goes, no, he goes, I really like it, I have to say, And the good thing is that Fabian loved to plot and plot, 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 plot. So it's like, okay, you plot, plot, plot. I'm going to have them have a touch football game.
Sure.
I don't know. That's not how it works. Where's Mr.
I think that makes them so much more relatable, and it just, the X-Men has this metaphor of being a family, right? And so the ways that family shows itself in their different character relationships, you have someone like Jubilee who's going through a lot personally, who is able to bring that joy to Xavier. You have even previously Jubilee, to tie it into Ilyana's death, like she was almost in a similar role that Evan was saying, like she didn't really know this kid, but is emotionally impacted by the death of a child in front of her. And like those things show up in our lives. And I feel like that kind of relates back to what we were talking about at the, how it moves people because they resonate with those relationships and those situations in their own life. And I feel like that's a layer of connectivity to the comics that you don't see a lot elsewhere.
And, I don't know. I don't want to, I don't read anymore. So I can't, I can't criticize, but from what I notice, like when I see a crossover event and the crossover event is like, Krakoa on steroids, it's like, okay, that sounds like something's happening, but that's not, Extinction Agenda where Xavier gets shot and, like there's not, you're not looking at the characters going, it's almost like playing pool. You hit Xavier shot by the techno-organic virus, and then that moves every ball on the table
Right.
So often it feels like it's somebody has these balls on the table and they go, okay, I'm going to put this one here and I'm going to put that one there and they're going to put that. And when it hits, oh, you know what I mean? It's like, it's just a different, it's like they're taking the characters and just moving them around instead of going, like cutting that billiard ball in half and be like, okay, what's the worst thing I can do to, this character right now? Or what's the thing that's going to make, like, one of my favorite scenes early on was, it was always like Rogue and Gambit, Rogue and Gambit, Rogue and Gambit, Rogue and Gambit. And I had never written, I think I wrote a little bit of Gambit, but everybody's like saying, oh, they can't get together. And I'd be at a signing and they'd be like, you're writing them so they can't be together. And I said, look, I didn't write any of that. So, I mean, I don't think I've ever had them speak on camera together to each other. But then when that issue came out, the techno-organic virus issue, where she's on the roof and she's just crying and she's like, I think I love you, but I can't touch you. You can't touch me. It'll never happen. And he's like, and he walks off and you're like, and she's devastated because she's like, damn it. And then he comes back with a blanket and puts it over her and just holds her. And it's like, oh, like what can you do in that moment of, I mean, it didn't solve any of their problems, but it made her realize that, oh, he does love her. He does care about her. And that was our first moment of like, oh, okay, instead of just, I don't know, not to, yeah. So like I say, it's just something digging in, excavating,
but
take
I mean,
time.
going back to what Justin was saying, like, that's real life though, like, in a way. I mean, hopefully not on the roof for someone who can't touch, but
well, how many
whatever lifelong issues are not going to be solved in a night, but hopefully one's life is made up of a series of those smaller moments, right? You do what you can in those moments. That makes it more real, So
well, and like if Ileana's dying, up until then, well, I'll just say this, is that if Ileana's dying, where does that leave, Jubilee? Like she's hanging around with 10 of the most powerful human beings on Earth, and they can't do diddly.
Right. And that's a real, that's real too, dying from an illness that, sometimes that happens.
Remember when Paige got drunk when she heard about the legacy virus, and she's like, all I want to do is to be the best. I want to lead the X-Men. I want to be the best X-Men. And you're telling me that I can die for no other reason than I'm here? That's not fair. Yeah, that would be her reaction,
Yeah, like leveling with the impact. I really liked what you said about the idea of arranging the reactions versus having it inspire how they would feel or how they would just go. It just kind of unravels the emotional impact through the filter of each character's point of view of like how they would hit with that news.
Yeah, and like I do remember reading the first issue of No More Mutants, because I'm like, oh, okay, what are they doing? And all these people are sitting around and Professor X wheels out and he says, Scarlet Witch is like too powerful, so we should kill her. And it's like, who just wheeled out here? Because it wasn't Professor X. I mean, Professor X is like would be the last guy, I was going to say standing, but the last guy sitting to protect her and say there's a way to help her. There's a way to, reach her. Like that's who he is. And so it was almost like they said, well, we need somebody to come out and say, oh, we have to kill her. Wouldn't it be powerful if it was Xavier? I'd say, no, it wouldn't be powerful. It would be a false to start your, crossover on. So, but I see that, I've seen that so many times. It's like, oh, here's our plot. Here's our event. Let's, we need this to happen. We need that to happen. It's like, how about we tell a story, and in that telling of the story, we'll know what happened.
The events almost dictate the character as opposed to the character dictating the events.
Well, when we did Age of Apocalypse, that was my first crossover because up until then, Fabian had, because again, Fabian loves to plot. And so with my crossover, I was like, you know what? I said, I'm so tired of like being part 23 of 47 story. Like who's going to read all those issues and stuff. And so we had this conference, and I said, look, here's the thing, Professor X dies, blah, blah, blah. And this is what's going to happen in X-Men Omega. I'm sorry, X-Men Alpha.
Mhm.
And this is what happens in X-Men
Mhm.
and in X-Men Omega, they have to be on the bridge because the bombs are going to drop and everybody's going to die. I said, so there you go. And then they were like, what? Wait, what happens in X Factor? I go, whatever you want to happen in X Factor in those 4 issues. And and they were getting mad. They're like, well, wait a minute. You can't just drop this on us. I go, I'm giving you the freedom to like tell whatever story you want.
Right,
I said,
to figure it out.
you just have to have them on the bridge. And it took people a while to get into it, but then all of a sudden they're like, wow, this is like, and then when the time came, they'd be like, what order do we read the comics in? I go, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Like, there's the first story of section. If you want to read Generation X, great. Enjoy the 4 best issues of Generation X ever. And I only say that because there's only 4 issues of Generation X. But if you want to read Astonishing with Rogue and Morph and Blink, great. If you don't, that's great too. Read X Factor, read Excalibur. And as it was, every Wednesday for that for a month, everybody was just like astounded that we had actually like committed that forcefully to Age of Apocalypse. But that's what, like was my feeling is like, look, here's the frame in which the story is. You write the story. I'm not gonna, it's like, well, I want Scott to be in charge of a death camp. Okay, well, then that's what he's doing. That sounds really interesting. It was like it just really let everybody have room to breathe, and I think
it just gave an opportunity to play with it, right? So you start from a new base, and then you say, here is the short-term end where we want to get to. Whatever you do along the way is just you jamming with those characters with this world set up, and really kind of a wild surprise to the reader who's just as aware of what's going on because of what the issue before was. There was no solicits to that degree, right? You're just figuring it out as it's happening.
And it's funny. Do you remember how Generation Next ended?
I believe didn't
yeah.
There were so many deaths in that run. I actually wanted to ask you about that. Didn't it end with Colossus's death, if I remember correctly?
No, it ended with pretty much all of Generation X. And what happened was I had just been broken up with by a very lovely girl. It was like probably the last time I really let my heart be broken. But so when we came to issue 4, I sat down to write it, and I'm like, you know what? Everybody died. I'm depressed. I want everybody depressed. Everybody dies. And so remember that scene when they're on the inside of the death camp. Skin gets killed, Trimmer gets killed. Paige looks at the doors and they're closing, and Colossus is on the other side, and she just gives this heartbroken look, like, really?
Yeah.
And then close, and she's dead. Yeah. And he goes back and says to Kitty, I tried to save them, but I couldn't. And in that moment, Kitty's like, yeah. And then like that relationship is not like everything had to die and end because Colossus had to save his sister, which we already saw what happened when he didn't. We saw what he became when he didn't, but now we saw what he became when he did, and how it pretty much destroyed him. And so, but that was, I didn't know that was going to happen until I started writing, and I'm like, you know what? I want everybody to feel what I'm feeling right now.
Well, it worked. It was, I still remember all these years later. I'm like, wait, what? But also, I don't know, someone who has a younger sister myself, I kind of understood it, but on the flip side, it kind of came back a little bit in the recent show, the recoupling of Magneto and Rogue in your other main ongoing AOA story. Where did that come from?
Well, I think it had been established earlier that Magneto was able to control, her powers. So I think that she would have been, if Xavier had been able to do it, he would have done it. But we never saw him do it. He promised, but he never could. He couldn't train it out of her. But you figure that if Magneto was the one to reach out to her and, finally help her, that would resonate very strongly with her. So, and what's funny is that I just read a controversy on line, just when you're scrolling, and people are like, oh, there's an age difference between the two of them, and that's not right. It's like, what? I've dated many people, and I don't know. I mean, like the only people that ever think about age differences are the people that are on the outside looking in, going, well, I think. Well, you know what? It doesn't really matter what you think. You're going to come home with us. It's not, doesn't really impact on us. So I think that, I mean, I just love, especially like when you look at Chris's, Rogue was always a very tortured character, and somewhere along the way she became like the real sexy character with sugar and da da da. And it was like, well, let's get, I mean, if Xavier wasn't there, what would her life have been like? And to think that Magneto showed up and was like, I can help you, I think they just would have, I think it made sense that they would fall in love.
It's the idea of like, if this is true, if I can be this one person who can touch your skin in this way, what else would happen from there? Like they would connect over that, and that she would actually have what she had wanted in her heart to be able to have a physical relationship with someone.
And it's a really weird, not weird, but like when you think about loneliness of the character, it's a profoundly lonely experience to, be told that if you touch anybody, you're gonna siphon the life out of them,
No, and it's a beautiful, it was a beautiful relationship and family that they built up in that short run. So, so going further back, I want to ask you about there was a lot of build up to your Generation X series. Curious how much of that you were involved with, from the resurrection of Emma and the Phalanx Covenant.
I started the Phalanx Covenant in I believe it was X-Men 300.
Yeah.
And it's not the first time that I introduced something with no plan at all. The guy gets in the car and the wife says goodbye, and you drive away and it says Phalanx something on the back.
Right, yes.
Like, okay. And people like,
what is that? Yeah.
Other editors were like, what is that? I don't know. I took a love.
We'll find out.
It's such a great word. So what happened was that Bob said to me, I just got back from England, which is kind of important. It was a comic book convention. And Bob said to me one Friday night, he's like, listen, the marketing, they want to relaunch New Mutants. So you need to think about a way to do New Mutants. Like, okay. And so I went home and I started going, wow, this would be really cool. And I was like, one of the first things I knew was that I didn't want, and when I say it's fine because, it was just me at first, but, until Chris and I teamed up, but it was, I was like, you know what? I don't want to do like if you look at New Mutants #1, it's 5 very lovely characters, except for Rain with her weird hairdo, but they just look like just teenagers that didn't look like they have a care in the world, except later on we find out that they have superpowers and blah blah. And I'm like, I want like Chamber, I want like somebody who blew his chest out, and so it was like, so I knew I didn't want Ken. I used to call them the Ken and Barbie mutants, Scott and Jean, okay, yeah, he wore eyeglasses,
the perfect couple with
but everybody had like things going on that were you just like, except for like Nightcrawler, Colossus could go back to human, and Wolverine looked like a guy with a cowboy
a short hairy man, but otherwise normal.
And so then I was like, and I don't want to put them in the mansion because I can't, it's already hard enough trying to send these guys off on mission. And then I thought, well, what about the Massachusetts Academy? Because everybody died. Well, but if everybody died, where is Emma? And if she saw that happening, she would be upset. And I'm like, well, what if she wasn't upset? What if she's working through this tremendous guilt over, the fact that she was, and I'm like, okay, so she could be a teacher, but then I'm like, but she needs a counter. And then I'm like, oh my God, Banshee. I've always loved Banshee. And he's a cop. So yeah, of course. And more than anything else, he's going to want to train these kids to be, and he's not a warrior like Cable, and he's not a, he's not an inspirational figure like Xavier. He just wants these kids to stay alive, which is what Emma wants more than anything else. And so it's like, okay, so what if these kids come in not to be future X-Men in their black and gold costume, but what if the goal is just to get them through training? And you know what? If one of them wants to become the next Magneto, hey, we gave it, we tried to instill what we could in them, but at least they're not going to die because of their powers. And so, somebody in England, when I was there, had said, there's a band here called Generation X, and that would be such a great name for like a group. And so I was thinking that, like, and so then on Monday I came in and said, okay, I want to do New Mutants, but I don't want to do the New Mutants. I want to do Generation X. And Bob was like, oh, Generation X, what's up? And then he went up to the people upstairs. He goes, listen, we have something called Generation. Oh my God. Ah! And everybody got excited. So that's where, that like pretty much that first weekend was like, I had everything in place, and then we needed an artist. And we had started Chris Bachalo on X-Men Unlimited, and he had done a few pages. Bob and I kept like looking, like, because the image guys had just left. So like, who is the, I mean, everybody, they were like siphoning off all of Marvel's artists. So we're like, who could do it? So I called up Chris Bachalo and I introduced myself. I said, listen, I am doing this thing, Generation X. I really want you to be the artist on it. He goes, oh, no, absolutely not. And then he said, why is that? He goes, well, because, I don't draw anything like Jim Lee. I go, dude, there's like 500 people that draw exactly like Jim Lee. If I wanted to, I would call every one of them and offer them this thing. I said, but, I don't want a Jim Lee clone. I want the original Chris Bachalo. So it's like, yeah, Scott. He goes, you don't understand. He goes, I do this, like I just did this issue of Death, and these two people are having a conversation on the step. And so I drew 2 pages of knees, with people, and like one leaning away from the thing, each other. One is above, and he goes, and that's what I find interesting. I said, Chris, if you draw 2 pages of knees, I will write 2 pages of knees. I said, I will never ask you, to redraw something. I will never do that. And he's like, well, so it's like, yeah, I can't really do it. So months go by, we're still looking. We knew it was going to be announced in San Diego, and no, that's not exactly right. So, but we knew that, okay, scratch that for them. We were just like saying, okay, we're not going to do it until we find the right artist. And I talked to Chris, and Chris said no. And about 2 months later, Chris calls and he's like, is that job still open? And I said, yeah, that's great. Why? What are you thinking? He goes, I told my wife I turned down the an X-Men book, and she said, no, you didn't. Call him. Thank you. And I go, well, you don't have to beg. We're going to the races. So we were going to meet in San Diego 3 months later. And about a month beforehand, he calls me up. He's like, okay, so tell me who the characters are, and then I can start drawing them. I go, no, I said, I don't work that way. I said, I don't want to just hand you something and say, draw this, like you're going to be drawing this every day for the next, 3 years. So let's figure out who the characters are. So he's like, oh, okay. So we sit down in San Diego, and I go, okay, I said, the only thing I know for sure is that I wanted a character called Chamber, and he blew out his chest cavity the first time he used his power, and the energy is like just pouring out of him. And he goes, that's really interesting, but no one could ever draw that. And I go, no one but you could draw it.
Yeah.
He goes, well, he goes, can you just, and he handed me his notepad. He goes, can you just give me an idea what you're talking about? And I said, yeah. And I essentially drew this.
Okay.
And 2 weeks later, the fax machine goes off and Chamber, exactly the way he's drawn in the series, came off the machine, and that's where we were. And I knew I wanted Paige. I said, yeah, she's like a shapeshifter, but she has to like rip her skin off. He's like, it seems really unpleasant, but okay. He, we talked about some other stuff, and then he called me up a few days later, and he's like, what about a black character who's like Wonder Woman? Like, she's just perfect. She's just, like a work of art. And I was like, well, yeah, we could call her Monet. I said, but rather than just have her be perfect, what if she is actually she's 18 in the book. She's actually two 8-year-olds, one who is autistic and one who is not. By when they unite, suddenly she's this brilliant, perfect character. And I said it'd be so cool because one day Emma and Sean are going to be like, discover this and be like, well, listen, we can't, it's one thing if you're 18, whatever, but we can't have we can't be responsible for two 8-year-olds. And then Claudia was going to say, this is the only hope my sister has of ever being outside of this shell that she's in. And it's not your place to take that away from her or from me. And so they're like, oh, shit. So now they have this, now they're looking at Monet as this 8-year-old who's in the body of Wonder Woman. And so that was really fun. So that's how Chris and I worked. He would, this idea, he said, he drew skin out once. And he's like, what do you think of this? The guy has too much skin. I'm like, oh, that's awesome. He's like, well, it's kind of joking, but okay. It's like,
that's so cool.
Envision exactly the panel that where she just shreds of skin just dripping off of her. Chris's art with your storytelling, that was quite that was one of my favorite books. It was very visceral.
Well, people were they were like, oh, Scott, you plot and then you script like the Marvel way, but you have to be scripting everything that goes on in Generation X. Like, you guys are like this, like there's no way. And I said, no, that is like jazz. It's, like I said, it's jazz. Like, we were just so, like he would draw an issue and he drew, I believe this is right, it's either this one or the Christmas tree, but he drew goblins trick-or-treating through the
I remember that.
Sent those pages in, and I'm like, all right, well, let's see what this story is here. Like, I never was like, Chris, come on, what are you doing? What is this? Why are these characters here? It was like, in fact, he just read one today, the issue with the seagull, and he drew the seagull on every page. Okay, well, then he's the narrator. So I had him narrating the whole story, breaking the fourth wall, before a certain, just kidding. But no, so it was like, but that's how we were. Like, I would challenge him to, the only time we ever had a disagreement was there's an issue with Skin where Skin went back to the place where he was raised, and he wants to talk to his mother, and so he meets her at the bus stop, but he's different from the last time she saw him. And so they sit there for a few minutes and he's trying to talk to her, and the bus comes and she gets on the bus and drives away. And it was all done in silhouette, and it was the most beautiful page I'd ever seen. It's like, and he wrote in the notes, like, this is what he should say and what she should say and what he would say and she should say and what he should say and she should say. And I said, Chris, this is like the most beautiful page I've ever seen, in my life. It's tear jerking. I said, it doesn't need any words. He's like, no, I think it does. I go, no, you're wrong. You did such a great job. And so that was really the only time we ever disagreed on anything. So.
Did you ever see the made for TV movie that was based on it?
I enjoyed it for what it was. It's like when you guys are, I mean, it's like you were saying that you are, you hadn't read any of the X-Men before me at that time. And the thing is that like when the X-Men movie was coming out, people would be like, well, what do you think of the team? And the story, and like Rogue is. I said, look, there's 30 years of continuity in a 2-hour movie. So I'm sorry, people are going to have to make choices, you know, I mean, to me, the X-Men will always be Banshee, Thunderbird, Colossus, Nightcrawler, Sunfire, you know, that was the first real issue that, you know, and to me, that's who they will always be. But to some people, they'll be Stan and Jack's, you know, yellow and gold jumpsuit. There'll be some people love the Australia storyline, which I think is not a fan. I'll say that.
Okay.
But I understand that some people, that was their first issue and you know, their first exposure to it. And so similarly, like, you know, if you take into account that it was a movie with people with superpowers at a time when there really wasn't the special effects that we have today, they did a good job. My favorite part, I had a huge crush on Finola Hughes from General Hospital, and she played White Queen.
Okay, yeah.
There's a scene where she comes to these steps and she's talking to Banshee, and she has the, you know, white leather suit on, and it looks like she's never worn heels a day in her life, because all of a sudden she comes to steps and she was horrified. I'm like, oh my God, what a great scene. You know, so it was like, but, you know, I thought they did a good job for what it was. So,
I also wanted
you know,
to...
I liked it. I'll tell you, I liked it so much, and I missed the first few minutes of it because I was late to the theater. They did a special screening for everybody at Marvel.
Nice.
And the lights come up, and I'm like, oh, wow, that was really fun. And 3 guys come up to me, and they go, we're really sorry. And they walked off. I'm thinking, I don't know, I liked it. So,
what were they sorry?
What did you think?
I also wanted to, so you brought up M's kind of, that one of the sisters that makes up the character of M is autistic, and autistic.
You are?
Yeah. And there's not a lot of...
You don't have a twin brother, do you?
No, and we don't combine to make an even older, perfect version of ourselves, unfortunately. But you know, there are unfortunately very few autistic characters, let alone superheroes, in comic books, and especially at that time. So yeah, thank you for that. That really...
You're welcome. I mean, you know, one of the things I loved about it was I always knew from the first time they met that they were going to rub up against each other. The perfect and Jubilee, who was like, when I was with the X-Men, and what made me laugh was like, someday she's going to discover that instead of slugging it out with, you know, essentially this young Wonder Woman, she would be like, I made an arch enemy of a 8-year-old girl. You know?
Right.
And when you read with that in mind, like once you know that, if you read the first few issues, it's really funny because she's just, you know, like she comes very haughty, but you realize that no, she's just trying to figure her way around.
Yes.
You know? This is what I was working with when I started with Bishop. So
I can see the yep.
The M detail.
I see it, yep, over the eye. Yep.
So trying to make all that make sense. It was
the X-TRAITOR.
I mean, I did enjoy the fact that this was a character who was coming at the X-Men from a totally different point of view. Like I love, you know, point of view characters, and his feeling is just like, I've seen as horrible as it's going to get, and we tried to split society into mutants and humans, each policing themselves, and it was a disaster. So I mean, so it just gave this idea of your Xavier's dream has to work, you know, and you guys have to, you know, create a world for us, because the world that wound up creating for ourselves was a disaster. So it was like put the emphasis more on them to, you know, get their act together. So,
and yet, spoiler for an almost 30-year-old story, but Xavier ended up being the infamous X-TRAITOR that was
that had nothing to do with me. I was against it very severe. But yeah,
I think that's an interesting development for Bishop to have come from that future where he had seen how this doesn't work, and then to also be a point of view character in Age of Apocalypse where a different crack at it is not working as well in a different way, and to continuously be thrust into the situations of other people around him.
Well, and it's funny because when we started, it was like, okay, what do we do with Bishop if he's coming from a future that doesn't exist anymore because everybody's going to be dead by the end of this? And so that was why he became this kind of, Oracle type of character who was, just knew that something was wrong and no one understood what he meant because there was never a world where Xavier had created the X-Men. So yeah, so that was interesting. I mean, he was a great, really fun character to work on. But I also had I always had a rule, which my own personal rule was never answer a question without asking another question as a result. And to me, it's like I liked Wolverine when Wolverine was Wolverine and his name was Logan, and that was all we knew. Like, I don't need the answer to every question. Similarly, like in the second season of Boys, have you watched Boys?
Yeah.
Like I thought Butcher was the most fascinating character in the first season, him and Homelander. In the second season, he's like, I gotta go see my mom about my brother who never talks to me and knows me dad. My dad was very mean when I was. It's like, what are you doing? He was, he was such a fascinating character, and you're just peeling away every slice of onion out of him, and then when you cut an onion, you start peeling. Eventually, you run out of onion.
Onion, yeah.
And
You end up with
so,
nothing.
and similarly, like with like people would always say, well, who's the traitor? I don't know. I don't, and I didn't know who the traitor was, but that was okay with me. And same thing with like with the Phalanx. I introduced the Phalanx. I had no idea who the Phalanx was. I created Onslaught as a character who could beat up Juggernaut. I thought, oh, that's cool. It's a character who beat up Juggernaut. And,
right.
He says Onslaught and passes out. When that happened, an editor went to Bob and said, listen, Juggernaut is one of our strongest characters. You can't have somebody just beat him up. You have to explain who Onslaught is. And I said, so Bob came to me and goes, so you have to explain who Onslaught is. I go, no, I don't know, and I don't care. Like, I don't,
fair enough.
Doesn't matter to me. And so 6 months later, when they decided to do Heroes Reborn, they're like, we got to figure out like who can create this whole other world, right? And we're like, oh, well, Dr. Octopus can't do it. But Skull doesn't have the capacity to do it. We just used Apocalypse. And then I was home one day and I was like, oh my God. And then I came in the office and go, Onslaught can do it. And I'm like, well, who's Onslaught? I go, well, he's strong enough to beat up Juggernaut. I'm sure he has power.
That's all we know so far.
And so, but what's really, really, really interesting is once we decided that, there's about 2 years before that, I think, when Xavier turned off Magneto's mind, catatonic character with the acolytes who were,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
So all that was there. And I was like, well, what if he didn't turn off his mind? What if Magneto's been in his mind the whole time? It's like, I'm going to separate his mind from his body so that I can help him get along the right track. So while he was trying to help Magneto was corrupting him. So what is the creation of their minds into one mind? And then that became Onslaught. And once you decide that that's Onslaught, and which is really fun to me, because again, like I like picking up breadcrumbs along, like leaving them and then picking them up. Sure. But that issue of by tying in Xavier and Magneto after Wolverine had his skeleton ripped out, it's like, oh, okay, well, look how far back they've been planning that. Wow. He planted that seed 2 years ago. And then when a little closer, if Professor X was going to be corrupt, who is the very first person that he would go after? His stepbrother,
yeah,
at his youth. And so then you go, oh, that's why the first time we see him, he's beat the shit out of Juggernaut. Oh yeah. But it was really gone. Oh, kind of interesting. Like
I mean, I reading it, I assumed, that at least from Juggernaut, it must have all been pre-planned because it makes
organically connecting the dots.
And again, that's the Fabian hated me for it because she's like, you have to have a plan. I go, oh, maybe the plan will show itself.
And it did. So you did write the issue that where Colossus sacrifices himself to wrap up the whole legacy virus storyline, right? So, because I noticed that you left the books and then they brought you back in to do that and then do Eve of Destruction.
Yes, was it called the Magneto War? No, yeah, well, even Destruction. Oh, and Operation Zero Tolerance, which introduced Bastion. Those were the two books that I was doing at the time.
Yeah.
But what happened was they said, we need somebody to like get us ready because Grant and Joe were going to take over, but it kept getting moved more and more.
Okay.
So they said, yeah, so just come in. And I felt, you know what, I introduced the legacy virus and then I never really wrapped it up. It just kind of stayed. And so I was like, it makes sense that if, Ileana was essentially was, patient zero in a lot of ways, that it should end with Colossus. And then, and again, like, you guys may notice, maybe don't notice, maybe readers don't notice, but like, to me, I'm always intrigued by characters who haven't been in the spotlight for a long time. It's like the Forge and whatever it is. I was like, I want to do something with Colossus. And I said, can I have him sacrifice himself? And they said, sure. There were no plans for him between those two books going forward. And I thought that I had done the most spectacular thing in the history of comic books, which was the next issue. Kitty takes his ash and spreads them over the Orstodensky plains in Russia. And I'm like, there's no way he's coming back from that. I got to kill somebody, and he's never coming back. And then, they said that he was on his way to the
Break World or something.
To create he was on his way to the crematorium, and they switched the body. Well, I was like, how are they going to explain that? And then I'm like, okay. I think I even jotted a note to Josh going, okay, you got me.
And would I be mistaken for thinking that the initial concept for the legacy virus back in the very early 90s was, basically a response to the AIDS epidemic and AIDS scare of the time?
Yeah, it was a metaphor,
Yeah, okay.
But, it's sort of like when Bobby came out of the closet, long after I left, people were always saying to me, what's up with him? And I'm like, like I thought metaphorically, it's cool that your dad is a horrible bigot against you. And like the one thing you are at your core is the one thing that your father can't get past.
Right.
And to me, metaphorically, that's a very powerful metaphor. Long after I left, they said, oh, we'll make Bobby gay because look of it. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But I just think it worked better as a metaphor. Not that
whole issue where Rogue joins him to
that road trip.
Yeah, this is beautiful still. Just I mean, again, these character-driven issues, and Operation Zero Tolerance, which you began to speak about, and they just recently. What was the genesis of Operation Zero Tolerance?
Well, the idea I had was to mostly I felt that the X-Men had gotten too big, not in a like too big for your britches, but too big in the sense that, like there's an early issue of the X-Men where something happened to Professor X. The X-Men had to show up in a station wagon. You compare that to like the Avengers have the Quinjet, and the X-Men had to show up in a station wagon. This is like way, way, way back. And I thought, like there was a time when there was a difference between the X-Men and the Avengers. And now anytime they need to be anywhere in the world, they hop on the Quinjet and the Blackbird, and they're there. They somebody gets hurt, they bring them to the healer down in the
Morlock tunnels
and then they're back to and it was like just everything was I wanted to get them to rock bottom again. I wanted them to like, if you're going to be a mutant and you're going to fight for a world that fears and hates you, that should be your mission statement, not we live in a mansion, we
Everything's perfect.
yeah, if we need a blackbird, we push the button and the pole swings up and
Yeah.
here's the blackbird. And it's like, and I just think over the years, I think they just kind of like lost track of what, and so I was like, let's just to run them to ground, and what I was saying before about, Grant and Joe were supposed to take over, but they had not taken over for a few months at a time. And then they said, hey, would you do this arc? And both of those arcs were designed to keep going. If they had to go 4 issues, or if they came back and said, hey, they need 4 more issues to get ready, I would have just kept telling those stories. But so as it was, I mean, I can tell you what the final moments of Operation Zero Tolerance is going to be, where they take, in the book, they take Bastion away. Then what was going to happen is, Cecilia, Sabra, Bobby, and Sunfire were going to be on the ground. They're going to be like, oh my God, which is what happens. They're like, oh, this is terrible. And then all of a sudden, because they take Bastion in to shield the helicarrier. Right. And the idea is suddenly the helicarrier was going to be like shaking, and everybody looks up and like, what the fuck? And it was going to rip in two, and Magneto was going to be enough is enough. And then it was like, oh, shit. Like after all they've been through, Operation Zero Tolerance was going to keep them, because essentially then it's like, well, we need, all those shield agents dead, it falling on the city. It was going to be like, well, now the X-Men are really, really on the run because, it's just killed a whole bunch of people in New York City. And so that was the plan. But, it would have been really cool. But
it sounds really cool.
Yeah, and especially to keep on evolving on the Sentinel existence and what that means as a threat to mutants, how to just up the ante with Bastion, with Zero Tolerance, and that's great.
Yeah, I kind of always had another rule that I always had was never, I tried to never go back in the sense of like, like I would, like the Acolytes, the idea of doing the Acolytes instead of doing Hellfire Club again. Like instead of doing the Brotherhood of Evil Mutants, it was always, what's the next thing? I didn't have and I also avoided things that I didn't understand, like Mr. Sinister. Like Fabian loved.
Yeah, I was just thinking that. I think that's fine because Fabian used Mr. Sinister a lot.
Yeah, and he would say, "What about?"
He was good at it, but
well, I would always say that, like, as near as I can tell, all Mr. Sinister does is at the end of an issue when he appears, is he goes, "I'm thinking, oh, that's that."
Yeah,
that's where that goatee came from.
Right. Yeah.
I think it was an Extinction Agenda. I wrote him for, I don't know, like 3 sentences or something. In the 7 years I was on the book, I don't think I ever wrote him because I didn't get him. I didn't understand. So I tried to avoid things I didn't know.
So I have a gazillion other questions that I could ask, but Justin, do you
Justin's like, I only have 2 gazillion.
Hey, Justin's just sitting here patiently.
It's been good to jump around too.
Where's your wife? She should get in one question. Is she around?
Yeah, right.
She's not home right now, but
okay.
I will say, speaking towards your wife, who's a big fan of Emma Frost and Kitty in the comics, Justin, if I'm not wrong in their relationship.
Yep.
So much of that Emma Frost redemption stems from, and I've told her this through DMs and stuff, that I personally feel like when you have the White Queen of the Hellfire Club and you have the future X-Man and friend of Kitty Pryde, Emma Frost, that what you did with bringing her back, putting her in Bobby's body, putting her in the Massachusetts Academy, was really like the redemption arc or the missing link between the two versions.
Well, you want to hear, I'll tell you a little inside baseball. Somebody told me when I was at a convention, somebody came up and said, white characters don't work. I'm like, what does that mean? And he said, like, Silver Surfer, Moon Knight, Iceman, like they're just, you have all these colorful images and then you have these white images on the page. And, that's why they don't work. And I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. So I came down and said to Bob, I go, what if, like, he's made of ice. Like, why is he always like essentially this ice cube? He's just white. whatever. And I said, I would like to, just play around with him over a few months. And he goes, no, you can't, because he's a toy, and they released him as a toy, and you can't. Marking won't let you do it. The toy company will be very upset. And I said, oh, okay. So then I'm like, I was like, well, what if White Queen takes over his body and does things that he never imagined were possible?
Right.
We just one night, and that story was a really sweet, sad story about her coming to realization that when she came out of her coma, everybody was dead, all the students.
Yes.
So it's like, and then Bobby has to deal for several months with the fact that, like, I have just been, backing off for, the last 15
She did things with my body that I never even knew. Yeah.
And like for him, I just was happy playing the clown.
Right.
And so I did that issue, and I thought it was a very emotional issue. Yeah. And then it came out 2 months later, and Bob calls me and he goes, the toy people want you to play around with Iceman more because they love it. And so they can add on all these legs.
I still have that toy. It's an awesome figure.
And especially what that does for Iceman as a character, that he has so much untapped potential that it takes someone else in the driver's seat to understand what else he could do. And I feel like that started the conversation to where he is now as an Omega level mutant in the stories of just there's an untapped potential of how else he could take his moisture absorption and creation powers.
Yeah, and that was, it was like, I would do things that if you stood back and go, well, Scott, you wanted your own way, so you did a story where Iceman, and Emma, blah, blah, blah. But I'm like, okay, that's fine. But I wrote a really emotional story that resonated years afterwards.
Yeah.
So it's okay. So I don't mind,
to this day.
And I'm like, I don't mind not cheating. But another thing was not Chris. At one point, Joe Mad wanted to leave X-Men to go do Spider-Man. And I'm like, Joe is the best. Do whatever Joe wants. And they were like, no, you can't, because, the X-Men can't take the hit of you leaving, so you have to stay. And I was like, I went to bat for him, and I was like, it's Joe, man. He should, like, really, like, whatever makes him happy,
right,
he should be able to do, because he's brilliant. And so they said no. So I wrote an issue of the X-Men where there were no X-Men in the issue. It was just what, we always hear about how people feel about mutants. I'm like, well, what about it? I mean, like, Spider-Man is the superhero. What is his perspective on the mutants? What is J. Jonah Jameson's perspective on the mutants? What is, Arrow, who was raised in this horrible dimension? Like, what is her? So the whole issue became about what people think about the mutants and X-Men without X-Men in the story. So it was like, was it a cheat because I used what's her name? Because I used Spider-Man through Spider-Man on the cover fighting Marrow. Yeah, that was a cheat. But it was also like a really, like, I loved when Bastion went to J. Jonah, and he's like, I need you to pick up the story and get hate mutants. He's like, why would people hate mutants? Like, what do you think? You think I'm like a bigot? He goes, I would never use the newspaper for that. Like, you're out of your mind. Like, the newspaper's about truth. And, I don't like Spider-Man because I think he's a menace. I'm not doing it to sell papers, and so, and
Banshee. And compare Bastion to a fascist. It was a great JJ.
I will tell you one thing. There is one page, and I'll tell you what happened was I sent all the characters in space, and they were like going, space never works for the X-Men. I go, yeah, but I want to, like, send them for a year, and when they come back, the Beast has a full beard, and Chip and Deathbird are married, and all this stuff up, and they're like, it doesn't work when they're in space. I go, it doesn't work in space because nothing happens. So, but what if they go in space? And when they come back, it's like this old movie, the Years of Our Lives, old war movie. And I'm like, what happens if half the X-Men come back from war? These guys are like living their lives. And meanwhile, they see planets destroyed, they see all these, you know, lives ruined, and then they come back, and it's like, how do you fit those guys back together? And that was my plan. They kept going, no, no, it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And so I called up Joe and I said, what page are you on? And he's like, oh, Gambit is looking at a reflection of himself. And I said, because he was out in space, I said, okay, just have him turn around and it's the danger room. And he's like, what do you mean they're not in space? I go, no, they were never in space. It's like, I'm
It's
done
all
fighting. I'm not going to fight with them anymore. So they were just in the danger room, you know, which was the only time I used the holograph for a danger room because I always thought it was a cheat. Okay, yeah, so I left.
Was
But
that
you know, Bastion was another character. Like I was like, okay, so he's with the Phalanx, but you know, again, I mean, I just, you know, I wasn't somebody that created character. You know, I couldn't fill out the Marvel handbook guide to the Marvel universe.
sure?
You know, when I would create something, it's like, okay, who is this guy? Oh my God,
Yeah.
the first time he tortured Jubilee, like, oh my God,
Yes. And yeah.
But then the you know, you talk about characters that you brought in, Amelia Voght as an interesting way of showing some of the negative impacts of Charles's dream. I always thought that she was an interesting kind of counter to what would go too far when he was pursuing what he wanted, what he thought, and really showed kind of an emotional destructive way of how it affects other people.
And that was like a cautionary tale so that when we see Xavier, we realize that like that's who he became. He became a person that wouldn't use their powers to, you know, take over someone. I mean, oddly enough, in the beginning of X-Men,
right.
that, you know, that the Beast was a football player, you know, like, so he did do things like that in the beginning, but the idea is that like he did something really bad a long time ago and he lost the love of his life and he would never do that again. I mean, you know, it's interesting because I did an issue of Superman where Superman read, you know, Lois was upset about something and she was reading a text and he read the text through her and it was about her moving in with this guy. It was New 52. And
Okay.
people were so mad and they're like, Superman would never, ever read someone's text. I'm like, Superman can hear,
Right.
you know,
Spying on everybody.
Yeah, right.
that's true. So yeah, and if you think that you are gonna think that an alien who has these abilities are not going to use these abilities as a person, then you're out of your mind. Similar to what we were just talking about, we were talking about
Amelia Voght.
Yeah.
oh yeah, yeah, I mean, like, you know, Xavier, I mean, like, who doesn't? I mean, honestly, you know, I have a friend staying with me and drives me crazy for like the dishes that don't get done, and you're telling me that if you didn't have that ability, be like,
Do the dishes.
you would,
Sure.
but
Yeah.
Xavier, in that time, Xavier realized that that was a line I should not have crossed, and it's been haunting him for years, and that's why it takes place in that issue. The Lions Come at Night, where we realize for the first time that Magneto is, you know. And the thing is, did you guys ever watch MASH?
I did. Yes, big fan of that show.
You watch the last episode?
Yes, I don't remember it real well, but I
Hawkeye
did watch
is Hawkeye's in an asylum. It's because a chicken, North Koreans were there.
Oh, yeah.
So
Brilliant
the
episode.
chicken was going to give them away.
Right.
You kind of kill that chicken. And so the woman kills the chicken.
Yeah.
And later on, he remembers the story again. And by the third time he remembers the story, it turns out she wasn't killing a chicken. She was killing her baby. And he felt like, as a doctor, for all those years and all those things that he did, that it all was for nothing because he essentially was responsible for the death of this baby. And it was like the most poignant episode. And I stole that for that issue, was because Magneto, I mean, Xavier's like, we were going out and then she left me. He's like, oh, she left you? It's like, yeah, we were going out and we had a talk and then she left. And he's like, oh, you had a talk and you left? Oh, and
Okay, well, actually, yeah.
like, oh my God, I did the one thing that, you know, in that moment, I became everything that I didn't want to be.
Yeah.
So, you know, it was like, oh my God. So that was, but I loved Amelia. But again, when she showed up as that redhead in Accolades, I didn't know who she was.
Right.
Yeah, it's the character. And then one day I'm like, oh my God, what if she
Yeah, no, and then she showed up in X-Men 97 briefly.
Yeah.
She was working in Genosha.
It's also interesting. She was referenced recently in a current issue, and to see these characters still being a part of the story and still adding new layers to what they're doing and how they interact with the other broader X-Men universe.
Well, what's funny is I was talking to a friend of mine who was a writer of many years, and we kind of revealed the deep dark secret of writing on a series for a length of time, which is that you do your work and you try to do your best work, and then everything that comes after you is fan fiction. Like, I'm sorry, it's just, you look and you're like, oh my God, I would never do that. So you can't really, it makes it very hard to enjoy other people's choices because you're like, what? So
I mean, that's fair.
I also found out that's true of like we all, nobody is like, oh, Scott did a great, Chris never said Scott did a great job. Chris once said, he's like, I spent 17 years on the book and it took them 6 months to gut the X-Men universe like a raw fish. Like, oh, okay. Not very nice. But, and we didn't speak for many years, not because I wasn't speaking to him, but just because he didn't have any use for me. And then years later, we become friends. Now we talk and da da da. But, people are always like, well, you didn't do what Chris was going to do. I go, I didn't know what Chris was going to do. I didn't know pipeline to Chris, I didn't make it up.
Yeah, that's like the challenge of being on this IP that had generations, and a new person comes on, they have new ideas, new direction, and they want to explore what they want to play with. And I feel like that's what, as long as there's an intentional respect of what has happened and what else that they could go to, it just makes it part of a story. That these characters, they're not frozen in time. They change, they grow, they react, they have new stimuli. And I feel like that, again, is another layer of how they are complex and not just two-dimensional.
I mean, like with you compare their run with the Avengers run, and it's like, the Avengers were originally made up of characters that had to go back to their own book.
Right.
So you could really impact on them, whereas the X-Men was like the Wild West. You could do whatever you wanted to with these characters. Like I'll look at they brought at one point they brought Marrow back, and she was gorgeous, and it's like, oh, it's just,
yeah, I wasn't a huge fan of that decision.
yeah. But I was like, you take the one thing that's interesting about the bones piercing her skin and how horrible and how painful it is, and it's like, I will cure it. It's like, okay, now what?
Kind of what you were talking about previously about pulling the curtain back on Wolverine. We've taken the mystery, we've taken the element that was driving their suffering, and or who was the filter for their point of view.
And people would always say, well, Rogue and Gambit, like, why don't they just up in a bunk bed over Leech? There's an idea. It's like, well, a little creepy. Let's start there.
Yeah, that makes me feel bad for Leech.
But it's also like, let's take it'd be like if somebody came on to West Side Story and said, what if they get married at the end, and then next episode, it's about them bringing both gangs together and everybody's happy.
Sure.
That's not fun. If Scott could just control his powers, then, what's the point of,
where's the conflict?
No,
and I get it. I mean, it happens all the time in comic books too. Like,
Xavier can walk now, and
Well, but and it's also I think Dan Slott is a genius, and what he does when he comes on is he just rethinks things, and I'm just always in awe of him. But too many times people will get Captain America and they go, I'm going to do Captain America, and somebody's going to be plotting against them, and then at the end of the first issue a limousine is going to pull up and the window's going to roll down, and you're like, and Red Skull's behind it all. Yeah, Skull is behind it. And it's like, people love to, you wait, you try to get on your book your whole life, which is younger now than it used to be, but you want to get on a book, and then you want to tell your your Red Skull story.
Yeah.
You want to tell your octopus story. You want to tell, and so I get it. I get that, people are like, I'm going to do the issue where, Cyclops, Sinister gives them contact lenses, and now he never has to worry about. It's like, okay, well, glad you got to tell that story, but
I mean, I was thinking about this, and I think the two biggest changes in the medium of American comic books, at least for the big two, since between the 90s and now, is people don't tend to stay on a book for quite as long. I mean, you were working in the X office for close to a decade. Now writers come in, do 12 issues, sometimes a year, start early. And I feel like you're absolutely right that they all come in wanting to tell their Red Skull or their Joker story. So every year you have a new Red Skull or a new Joker story. And I feel like the other thing that happens as a result of that is, I feel like we're starting to move away from this, but for a while, a lot of comics were being written for trades, as opposed to, I feel like before, like trades had always existed, but I feel like trades became a driving force for a while. And when that happened, it's harder to write, like you were saying, you like to pick up breadcrumbs. It's harder to do that when you're writing for trades because everything has to have
arc structure.
Exactly right. I don't know if that makes sense, but
well, even back then when we were doing these huge crossovers, I would always feel a tremendous sense of guilt because you don't want to write a 22-page book that somebody can't enjoy because it's part of a bigger story. I always tried my best to make it so that if you read an issue that was part of a crossover that I had written, that you didn't have to read the crossover and you still get something out of it.
Sure.
And similarly, like I have been in a position where they'll say, oh, no, you have to do an arc that's 6 issues so that we can collect it in a trade. And I'm like, okay, it's not what I think is ideal, but my goal then would be to still write those 6 issues so that they are 6 individual stories with enough of a through line that you go, okay, this is satisfying. Not to, I wouldn't want to do a story where it's like the first issue is knock knock, and the second
issue is
there, and the third issue is mosquitoes, and the fourth issue is just mosquitoes who, and then becomes a punchline. Like I would never want to do that. So
sure, you heard us.
I've been doing a lot more since X-Men Animated. I've been doing a lot more podcast. I think what might be fun for me is I used to go to parties and I would lie.
Okay.
People go, oh, what are you doing? I go, I'm a vet. And they go, oh, I'm a vet. That's right. Like I'd be a plumber. I'd be like, I'll go to a wedding and people go, how do you know the bride and groom?
Sure.
I'm like, oh, he and I used to be lovers. And my friend go, oh, and then invariably somebody would come and go, he wasn't my lover. What the hell are you talking about? And so I just, it was just to keep it fun for me. But maybe what I'll do now moving forward is I'll find one story about, how'd Zero Tolerance start? I'll just tell an entirely different story each time
there you go.
wait for people to go, well, wait a minute, I just saw the odd podcast last week.
No, I was lying to them, but I'm telling you the real
yes.
info here.
Just a public service announcement. If you watch more than 2 Scott Lobdell podcasts, you need to
fact check.
Go out and touch grass or something,
Go outside, enjoy the sun.
Oh, good, yeah. So, I mean, I did want to talk about X-Men Unlimited because the couple of issues that really stuck out, the first one and issue 4 specifically, it's interesting.
God, talk about it. Universally hailed as the worst thing I've ever written. But
really?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I love that. And the cover is so striking. Why that blows my mind.
Evan's like, I can think of 10 things that are worse.
Yeah, right.
The thing is I
Clearly
wanted
these people are
I
misinformed.
really wanted to do Nightcrawler and Raven,
Mm.
Raven Darkholm.
Darkholm, yeah, Mystique.
And then Bob's like, well, use Rogue in it too, and do this, and so it just became a bit of a soup that I was not,
Well, I think that just as a format for a story is really interesting because it gets back to how you started in X-Men and Marvel with the 8-pagers with the Marvel Comics Presents roots of like one shots focusing on either a character or a small group. But now you have this larger play set of what the characters are that you're working with, and you're able to really tell these one shots that are along the lines of continuity or filling out different ideas. Was there any difference in approaching these as kind of like single issue explorations versus longer arcs that were more like 3 to 5 building an idea?
Well, one of the very first things I did when I broke in was I did a 3-page NFL Super Pro story that was inserted into football stadium, those books that you get.
Okay.
And I remember at the time being very excited. People go, it's only 3 pages. I go, oh, but it's 3 pages that I get to write.
Sure. Yeah.
And so to me, the type of story that you write for a 3-pager is different than the type of story you write for an 8-pager, which is different from the 22-pager. And so whenever an annual would come along and they're like, oh, you have to fill out 60 pages. I'm like, holy, that's awesome. Like that first issue of where X-Cutioner is introduced. Oh my God.
Yes.
But so, yeah, no, I mean, and that's what, like, the first issue is very simple in the sense, like, what happens when you take the 2 leaders and the leader, and you put them in a place where their powers don't work, like, what is that like? And so that was a really fascinating character study. The second one, I just felt that it was over plotted and it had just too many threads to pick through. I mean, if it was just a mother and her son, she had to explain that, yeah, I dumped you off and you left you for dead and you joined a circus, that would have been, heartbreaking for me. And I would have loved to have done it that way, but
other layers added in. Yeah.
I mean, I get that as the writer, but as a fan, it just, again, it read more like a small family unit story to me.
Well,
I enjoyed the brother, sister, mother aspect.
Well, like when she threw him off the waterfall, I believe.
Yeah.
When it came out, people were like, there are no waterfalls in Germany, so I don't know where.
And then that scene gets, there's no waterfalls in Germany. I'll have to double fact check that, but I trust it.
Did that happen in the animated series too?
It did. She chucks the baby off. There's a scene of Mystique literally chucking her
There's
baby
actually
off the waterfall.
there's a toy that comes with a little baby Nightcrawler.
Swallow the nearest waterfall or bathtub. You can reenact this in yourself.
Yeah.
Throw your own baby Kurt off the water into the.
This is an inside baseball thing, but I was Excalibur 31 was the first 22-page story I got to write, and it was about Nightcrawler landing on an island and fighting Krakoa's son, seedling, and he comes across this, he comes to this island and he had to fight and blah, blah. And I had a very, very short window. In fact, I was leaving on a Friday and they called me up and they said, listen, you have to turn in pages to the artist over the weekend. We don't care what happens. You just have to write this because it has to be out the door in like 2 weeks. Like, okay, I wrote the story and then I get the artwork back and there's this girl who finds Nightcrawler, this native girl who finds Nightcrawler washed up on shore, and she falls in love with him and they're going to get married and such and such. And I called the artist. I go, what is this? And he goes, oh, I thought it'd be cool if like she falls in love with, like this woman falls in love with him. And I'm like, he's blue and furry, and he washes up on shore with a demon tail and yellow eyes.
Yeah,
Like,
right.
who is this woman that falls in love with him? That's the oddest thing I've ever heard. You know, a
Maybe
pointy
she's
tail
blind.
like a demon. Like, oh yeah, oh my god, did you see that demon that just washed on shore? Oh my god, he's so hot. So I took the page. I said, okay, thanks. I took the pages, and then I had her not speak any English. And so he's trying to guess what she's saying. And so all that plot thread was gone. And all it was about was him getting to the Krakoa's kid and stuff. But it was like, you know, so it's interesting because if you're working with art, you can
Yeah.
really make it do what you want it to do sometimes if you're.
You wrote the issue where Warren's metal wings fall apart.
They didn't fall apart. He woke up one day and he had his regular wings back.
What was the because I feel like Warren's gone through so many switch back and forth so much since then. What was the
Well, as a fan, Warren was always one of my favorite characters, even when he was back in the Champions.
yeah.
What I like most about him is he's this rich guy with hollow bones who is always on the front lines.
Yeah.
The guy next to him can level a mountain with his eye blasts.
Right.
You know, the guy to the right of him has this ability to like cause an avalanche out of thin air or freeze people in place.
Sure.
And then you have this guy who
can fly and
that's it.
Yeah,
He's not
does weigh a lot.
Oh,
Like,
interesting.
And to me, like that is the guy. Like that is the guy who's most interesting because he's the one that like throws himself in the middle of every adventure with these incredibly powerful, interesting people, and he's there in part because he's a rich guy who needs to figure out a way to give back for all that he has. And to me, that was a really fascinating character. And then when they said, oh, you know, when X Factor first came out, they said, you know, all these characters are really powerful, and Warren's not powerful, so we're going to make him powerful. And you give him metal wings, we're going to turn him blue. And I'm like, oh, that's so ugh. Like I didn't, you know, from that point on, I didn't, you know, I just as a fan, I didn't like it. And when I came on the book, I did good Warren stories as whatever. But then I thought, you know, one day he was Warren, and the next day he wound up with his wings all in a totally different place. I thought, well, what if he just wakes up and he's, you know, in an alleyway? You know, did it wear off? We don't know. Did it, you know, did something else happen? Did Sinister take him? I don't know. He could have. But yeah, so I wanted to get. I mean, personally, I don't do a lot of things for personal reasons, but personally, I wanted that Warren. I like that character. You know, I just think he was always.
That makes perfect sense.
Being whining blue character was just never didn't really do it.
Yeah, I feel like that's another change past it. The days of being the whiny blue with the metal wings.
Does he have a what does he now?
Recently, he had the ability to transform between the two sides. At least that was in Krakoa, and then he died again.
One thing that I'm proud of is I believe, and your app can tell you, but I believe I've never bought somebody back from the dead, and I think that was a good.
Right.
Yeah, no, that makes sense.
To not undo or to change, but to, you know, like take the things as they are.
Yeah. Well, I could
Who's that on your hat?
Oh, it's
okay.
The animated version of the team by a very talented online artist.
One thing that I think that would be worth mentioning as we're closing up, and especially with how much it meant to the character, Northstar is coming out, and just what that meant to not only the character, but the franchise and representation, and him kind of bonding with this daughter that he had found, kind of rescued, and also the stance of Major Maple Leaf as like what he's talking about as a statement about gay people and how the AIDS epidemic is filtered through their experience and treats them as statistics in it. And I thought that was a really poignant stance on rights and perception and the AIDS epidemic at that time?
I was there's things called inventory stories. I don't believe they do them now, but it used to be every book had to have an inventory book, so that if you missed or if you were coming really close to missing your deadline, this book would be lettered, inked, colored, and they could rush it to the printer, and then you had to deal with what happens next issue. And so when I came on, I said I want to do an inventory story, and I want it to be about Northstar coming out of the closet. My editor was like, "Why do you want to do that in particular?" And I said, "Because Northstar has always been a colossal asshole. To me, the reason why is because he was closeted, and his idea was, if I keep you away from me, you don't get to judge me. I'm just going to be an idiot. Everything is always, 10 feet away. No one wants to talk to me. No one wants to hang out with me. That's fine. And I said, and I believe it's because he has closeted himself. He was an Olympic star. It never came up. He was a superhero. It never came up. But the very first time we see him in Alpha Flight #1, I don't know if you know this, if you remember it, but he was at a pool party at his house, and it was all men in Speedos. And that was John Byrne's way of introducing him as a gay character. It was never allowed to be discussed. So when I came on the book 100 issues later, and I made that pitch to let's get that out of the way so that we can finally dig in and excavate and figure out who Jean-Paul is, it turns out that my editor's brother was gay. And she's like, "Oh my God, I'd love to have him come out and just be like a gay character. That's, perfect. We would love that." And then the editor at the time, Chris Cooper, was gay. I say at the time, I mean, was the editor at the time, but he's
right now it's still.
But he was like, yeah, let's do that. And we really didn't think anything of it at the time. We thought, okay, we'll do this inventory story. Maybe it will get used, maybe it won't get used. Bobby took a job. She got a promotion to the head of Spirits and Vengeance. And suddenly I got a new editor. And when I made the pitch originally for Alpha Flight, I wanted to shrink the membership down to 5 because it was too big, 16 characters. The first meeting, it turns out that he applied for the writing job the same time I did, and his thing that he most wanted to do was to use the 16 characters. So he's like, "Oh, I think we should bring back the other 11 characters." I'm like, "Nah, I don't did." And meanwhile, I got in the X-Men for the first 2 issues, and everyone's like, "Oh my God, this is," and blah, blah, blah. And so then when Northstar came out, he called me into the office and he's like, "Yeah, this isn't working, so we're gonna hire someone else." And people would be like, "Oh my God, you got fired because you bought Northstar out of the closet."
Oh.
And I'm like, if being fired meant getting on the X-Men, if that's the punchline, but I will say that, yeah, I mean, I wanted to tell a story that spoke to, at the time it was written, it hadn't been, it was still, quote unquote, a gay disease, and that was it. I don't even think Magic Johnson had contracted it yet, but it was, and it was like, okay, how do we tell the story using mutants to, and specifically his coming out, like he, I'll talk about Major Maple Leaf for a second, is that I don't mind when characters are wrong. I think it's great that people have different opinions. I'm not saying that, being bigoted or anything like that is something to celebrate. But I think when you're telling a story, it's important to have people be wrong sometimes. That was the idea, is, Major Maple Leaf, and introduce him as a character who was a hero at one point and lost his son and could never get his land legs back. And then suddenly he sees these headlines and it's like, oh, he saved the baby. And it's like, okay, so my son dies in a intensive care ward somehow, and everybody's celebrating that. And so you could see that there was a lot of pain in there, and you know, you don't look at him as like, oh, that's a character who's in pain. You think, oh, this is an asshole who, you know, at least that's where, if you don't read it as a piece, it's easy to look and say, oh, that's a jerk. Why do we want to read about him? But it's like, no, this guy's in a tremendous amount of pain.
Yeah.
And, you know, and it was really the first time that Northstar looked at the world from an angle that wasn't his, you know, stay away from me. It's like, well, what can I do to facilitate understanding? And what I can do is, as a member of Alpha Flight and as a former Olympian, I'm going to just come out and say who I am, and you know, and give permission to other people to be themselves. And then, you know, writing Jean-Paul going forward was easier for a lot of people that came after me because he was whole.
Yeah. No, and I feel like that is one of the earlier characters which gave readers permission to be themselves as well, which, you know, is a great thing about comic books and is very important.
Well, you know, it's interesting. There's an issue of that no one's ever discussed it with me. I think it was one of the strangest issues. I think it was around 397, and it was the one where the X-Men learn about a mutant that Cerebro picks up, and they're like, we have to go and collect this kid before the acolytes do. Do you remember that? No one does. No one's ever spoken to me about it. I don't feel bad. But what happens is the acolytes show up, and they're like, you know, we are mutant superior, and we are gonna, you know, take this and make him part of the acolytes, and we will rise up, and we'll be the most powerful group. And they get there, and the kid has Down syndrome, and they're like, but we're out. You know, in fact, they're even like, we need to kill this kid who is disabled because, you know, mutants are about, you know, being the most powerful,
being superior, and
and all of a sudden the X-Men are like, are you kidding me with it?
Yeah,
you know, like seriously, like your whole thing is, you know, we're number one and mutants are superior, but we're going to kill this one because it's not what we want it to be, you know. And I just thought it was like, in fact, the one who really befriends him is Warren at the time, because Warren was the one who was most not who he had been because of his, you know, whatever. But
the change.
But I like characters who, you know, are wrong, you know, and I think it's important to introduce characters like that into a script, because, you know, just having like, well, you be on our team, you be on our team, you know, let's each pull an arm, and you be okay, whose team are they on? But it's like, what happens when, you know, one group shows up and they're like,
never mind.
So, and I thought it was a terribly poignant issue, but maybe I'm wrong. But I like
I'm sorry. I want to read it now. Again, I'm sure I must have read it at some point.
One time in Alpha Flight showed up at remember the Plodex? The Plodex was like the aliens from Alien. And when there was one there, it was like the most devastating, horrible thing.
Yeah.
And they came across a hatchling place, and they come in and they're like 100,000 hatchlings that once they not hibernate, but came out of their incubation, that they would essentially kill the world. And, you know, half the team was like, we must kill these things before they ever
hatch, right?
And the other half of the team was like, we don't know that they're going to be evil, you know,
right?
They're on Earth. Maybe they'll have some kind of like, you know, is it our place to slaughter, you know, a race?
Yeah.
It's like, it was just so complex. I love the issue. Like, I love the fact that, you know, you had some people go, no, we got to kill them. And the other people going, I don't think we can kill them. It's not our place to kill them. You know, so it's like,
I mean, I feel like these internal debates that you're talking about is such a fundamental part of the X-Men in particular. I
hope they're still doing stories like that. I don't know. I don't even know. It seems like they're doing stories about what to wear to the Hellfire Ball.
Well, that era has ended, but yeah, no, well,
Did you say your wife is a big fan of the Krakoa storyline?
That's where we started talking. Yeah, so I had taken some time off of collecting and reading and then came back with House of X and Powers of 10 and really enjoyed that story and wanted to introduce her to that. And so that's where we started the podcast. And then so she read the entirety of the Krakoan era.
but then you guys have also
I
gone
don't blame
back
her.
and she's read other stuff.
Yeah,
Yep.
and I wouldn't blame it. I wouldn't blame her at all for it being her favorite because that is exactly what happens. You fall in love with
Yeah.
your X-Men, you know.
I mean, we were talking about that earlier. Your whatever era you came in on tends to be your favorite or your
It
most well
defines
remembered.
defines
Yeah.
who you think of as the X-Men, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, for me, it's, you know, the team having Thanksgiving at the school. For other people, you know, like you were saying, Stanley's original teams. For other people, it's Krakoa.
Yeah.
What's yours?
Well, I started in my first issue was the issue where Magneto ripped the adamantium out of Wolf, but then and yeah, that as an image was imprinted on my 6-year-old brain, and then but I wasn't.
Your parents are sick people letting you read that.
Yeah, blame it on my mom.
His parents were like mine. They weren't aware that this would be within the pages.
And then, but I really didn't get into collect serialized issues until years later. But what I started with were the black and white reprint books, the Essential X-Men books. And so I binged and read and reread from Giant Size on. And so it was often Wolverine, Nightcrawler, Colossus, Rogue, and or Kitty, depending on what Storm, like that mid to late Claremont era around like Brute and yeah, that was the team that like really cemented in my mind of the ragtag, like what are they doing beyond being at the mansion? I feel like that
you're a fan of the Outback era.
It's fine. Like I never got Longshot, never understood why he was, but I know people love him, so some people it's their favorite character.
Yeah, Longshot disappeared for a long portion of the 90s. I feel like him and Dazzler into the Mojoverse, but
but Nightcrawler was always my favorite, and Days of Future Past is probably my favorite story. And with a handful of others, exploration. It's hard to pick any one team set or story. Or when somebody asks me who my favorite X-Men is, I start listing off. All right, how much time?
I'm
just 3 to 5.
What's really staggering about Days of Future Past is in today, I mean, like you can remember things like Zero Tolerance, which took over 4 issues and whatever, and you go, but really, when you look at Days of Future Past, don't believe it was even a full issue.
Yeah, it was 2 issues, if I remember.
Yeah, not even. It was like half of a issue.
Yeah,
it was like when you think about the impact that had.
Yeah,
and that's what I loved about Chris's stuff. For even if they did things that you didn't agree with, you have to give him credit for
trying new stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just not afraid to
I mean,
after past, it still resonates, and really, it was
yeah,
like 1 issue and a quarter and a half or something, but
when you think about how much he reinvented that franchise.
Yeah, well, that issue where he remember they go and there's the carnival and the X-Men are there. There's that Magneto, and then he goes into space and he's on Asteroid M, and Asteroid M falls and it goes into Japan, and then from Japan it goes into Savage Land, from Savage Land to Japan. Like holy shit, who is like that? Again, the Avengers.
And half the team thinks that the other half is dead, and
and the Avengers could never do that, but went there. So God bless them.
So speaking of Magneto ripping Wolverine's metal bones out, being so vivid. Yeah, what Extinction Agenda? Is that or So was that the which Extinction Agenda, the Wolverine one, or was that the Strife one? Doesn't matter. With the big battle on Avalon, what was the thinking there? Do
You mean as far as having his adamantium ripped out?
yeah,
We were
deboning Wolverine.
we were at a convention, and I mean a conference, an X-Men conference, where Larry David was there. Larry David. Larry David, that would have been fun.
He was narrating the entire thing, sure.
Why are we doing this? But we were trying to figure out, like, okay, what can happen in this crossover that would be spectacular. We're all kind of generating ideas, and then Peter David just is like, well, why doesn't he just rip his adamantium out? Why did Magneto rip his adamantium out? He controls metal,
Right.
and that guy's made of metal. Why didn't he rip it out? And we were all like,
Makes sense.
like, how did no one ever think about that's the most spectacular, cool thing we could do for every 6-year-old reading a comic book.
Like Justin, giving him nightmares for
Right.
months.
Peter's like, oh, I was just kidding. You just came up with the coolest, best idea. It was, and everything, started to revolve around that. So,
Yeah.
So that was, again, it's like, it wasn't planned. It was just given a voice. And then you're like, oh my God, of course. Like,
It sounds like a lot of the best stories were a result of not, just wouldn't this be cool kind of ideas, not
and then again, other things like like I thought, it'd be cool if Wolverine was more and more and more feral because he didn't have his
adamantium, and he loses his nose,
losing the nose
with the blue bandana. Yeah, love that version. Can't wait to see him show up in the cartoon next season. But
absolutely, I want to see him try to sneak.
Yeah, and then so look, I have to ask, just because I'm a fan and I'm curious, but you don't have to answer. What happened with Generation X?
Oh, it's an interesting question because I don't really know. When I was when they said to concentrate, when Bob wanted me to concentrate on both X books, I was like, okay, it's time to let it go. And also, I was somebody who I always told people I don't want to be Chris or Peter, where I'm Peter on the Hulk, where like they become my characters and I'm going to write them until somebody pulls my wheelchair away from the keyboard with my fingers clinging to it. I was like, you know what? It's somebody else's time to do it. I got the impression that Larry and the editor, I don't know if they even read Generation X, I think it was like almost like a game of telephone. Like, what's Generation X about? Oh, there's a character who is made up of 2 people. Well, that doesn't make any sense. It should be Penance instead. I'm like, okay. I mean, like, I didn't follow it. I didn't read it. I don't, so I don't really know. I just, I know I listened to him on a podcast recently and he's like, yeah, they bought me in because the numbers were so bad that nobody was reading the book. And they're like, Larry, you need to come in and fix it. So, that's what I did. I came in and I'm the guy who comes in and fixes things. And so I fixed Generation X. And I'm like, remember Generation X not being fixed? I thought it was fixed when I handed it off. But, God bless Larry. I mean, he's a really good guy. It's just, I think our memories of Generation X is a little different. So
it was a long time ago. So, but yeah. What would the entire series have been like if it was just the Scott Lobdell Generation X book? Would have been very interesting.
Well, I as I get older, I think someday I'm going to be in a nursing home and I'm going to have somebody bring me every issue of every book I wrote, and I'll just sit there and be like, "Oh, that worked. That didn't work. Oh, that's interesting. I don't remember doing that. Oh no, now I remember why I did that."
The grand review.
Yeah, exactly.
And even now, like with you guys, it's there are things that I remember, when people ask, and then there are other things that I like that issue of Excalibur. I don't
Fair enough. I mean, going back, you wrote.
It'd be like saying, "Hey, what did you have?"
Much. Right. Yeah. 20 years ago on a Wednesday.
Yeah, for lunch on Wednesday.
Yeah. Sure, I ate something.
That's the beauty of the stories. They live on.
Yes.
And are revisited, and some people maybe just read it for the first time a month ago, or I recently, before starting the podcast, I had read through from the start and just read it as this one big story. And that was the first time I'd really binge read the X-Men as a narrative, and to see how it is shaped across the years and from different people. That's great.
Yeah, I'd be interested. I don't know. I'd be interested to see what, for the first few years, I was not Chris. That was
Sure.
almost
Yeah,
not Chris Claremont.
yeah.
But I think over time, again, like some people will be like, wait, which one was Chris Claremont? Like people will, I know that people who have read my run from the beginning are like, oh, this is what the X-Men were. I didn't, yeah, I don't know. I mean, the truth is that I always, any writer, anybody that's ever, any artist that ever works for me, like will go to design something and they'll be like, oh, everybody loves these boots and the buckles. And I always go, I've already seen the last next thing,
Yeah.
and I'm saying, do the next thing, create the next character. I mean, it would never happen, but I mean, I don't have any, I used to tell people that Chris could tell you what Aurora and Kurt had for breakfast that morning,
Hmm.
because that's how much he loved those characters.
Right. Yeah.
I only ever thought about the characters when I sat down to my laptop and I would write the story, and that was the end until the next time I had to write a story. So I don't feel that I I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I would rather do the next thing than the last thing. I mean, I think
Sure. Yeah.
my work stands as it was, and
Always looking ahead as opposed to behind. That's
yeah.
healthy.
And,
So what is next for you?
oh, I don't know. That's a good question.
I haven't found it yet, right? You gotta find it.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's okay. Maybe you're still looking.
yeah. No, I told you that I was that I sold this show.
Yeah.
So we'll see where that goes. So years ago, I was when I was a stand-up, I opened for Jerry Seinfeld, and we had been friends at that point. So the limousine picked me up, and then we swung around and got Jerry. And I said, "So what are you up to?" And he's like, I just taped these 4 episodes of a show called the Seinfeld Chronicles. See what happens. If it takes off, I'll do TV. If it doesn't, I'll just do the comedy.
Sure.
And that became Seinfeld. You just never know.
Right. Absolutely.
So,
Beautiful note to end on.
more name dropping. God, that guy drops names a lot.
No, so Scott, where can people find you? Where can people follow you?
They cannot. I'm hiding.
Just stay away.
No, I'm at Instagram at Scott Lobdell 2.0.
Awesome. And Justice.
This has been great. Great chatting. Great to hear from you, Scott, and to talk through all these classic memories and moments in X-Men history, and to really get to chat with you as a creator. And so you can find me at the X-Wife Podcast. That's THEXWIFE, like X-Men, not former wife. And we talk about, me and my wife, we talk about X-Men comics, conventions, and all sorts of other things. And
Right.